My name is Mary Catherine Huffman, and in this video, I'll be describing a measurement study that investigates modified versions of current measures of physical activity regulatory styles and physical activity identity for use among an older population. Physical activity regulatory styles and physical activity identity are motives that emanate from one's sense of self that could be used as targets in future physical activity interventions. Highly self-determined regulatory styles, such as identified regulation, integrated regulation, and intrinsic motivation, and having a strong physical activity identity can lead people to make behavioral choices that are congruent with core personal values, goals, and expectations affixed to an identity. However, a prerequisite for targeting and measuring these motives is having quality interpretable measurement instruments. This better ensures that conclusions regarding how these motives relate to physical activity, how they change in response to intervention strategies, and how they relate to other constructs are accurate. Many times, researchers take for granted the idea that certain measures, often created with younger samples, are appropriate for different contexts or populations. The purpose of this study was to examine measurement invariance across 4 weeks and between older men and women, and convergent and divergent validity of modified versions of the Behavioral Regulation and Exercise Questionnaire and the Exercise Identity Scale. Both scales were modified to reflect physical activity as opposed to exercise. Older adults ages 55 and older who were able to read and understand English and who had no indication of cognitive impairment were recruited from researchmatch.org. Individuals who expressed interest in the study and provided their informed consent filled out an online questionnaire at baseline and again at follow-up 4 weeks later. The questionnaire consisted of the Modified Behavioral Regulation and Exercise Questionnaire and Exercise Identity Scale, questions pertaining to participants' health and demographics, and a one-item measure of physical activity frequency over the prior month. 410 participants answered the survey at baseline, and 314 of those 410 answered again at follow-up. Psychometric properties were assessed within a structural equation modeling framework. First, measurement models were assessed for fit using confirmatory factor analysis. Model fit was determined through an overall consideration of several model fit criteria shown here. Second, the forms of the models were tested between groups of interest to determine if the general structures of the model were invariant. Third, factor loadings were assessed for invariance. Because factor loadings represent the relationships between the latent variables and the scale items, establishing factor loading invariance allows for testing other relationships involving the constructs. Finally, the latent variables of the scales were correlated with each other and with physical activity frequency to provide validity evidence. About half of the participants were women, the majority identified as white and were highly educated, and most experienced at least one chronic condition. The 6 subscales of the Behavioral Regulation and Exercise Questionnaire, measuring amotivation, external regulation, introjected regulation, identified regulation, integrated regulation, and intrinsic motivation, were found to fit the data well. All 6 subscales were invariant between gender and across 4 weeks, and the 3 more self-determined regulatory styles were strongly and positively correlated with physical activity frequency. We found that a 2-factor model of identity fit the data best. This model, representing the dimensions role identity and physical activity beliefs, was invariant between gender and across time. Both dimensions of identity were also strongly and positively correlated with physical activity frequency. Generally, the identity variables and regulatory styles related to each other in ways that were consistent with theory. Interestingly, while role identity was weakly related to introjected regulation, physical activity beliefs was relatively strongly and positively related to introjected regulation. To the extent that evidence is gathered from multiple populations, the adequacies of these scales rests on a more robust evidence base and, hopefully, encourages their use in behavior change research. Based on these findings, this study suggests that these measures of physical activity regulatory styles and physical activity identity are suitable for use among an older population.